Hey everybody, this is a piece by someone named Luca Micaloni. Um, it's a chapter from the Marx Key Concepts volume, edited by Riccardo Bellofiore and Tomasso, Redolfi, Riva. The chapter's titled The Automatic Subject. It says, the internet says, this is from the Istituto Italiano per gli Studi Filosofici. It says that Luca Micaloni graduated in 2015 in Philosophical Sciences from Roma Tre University with a thesis entitled Phenomenology of Capital, Epistemological and Ontological Aspects of the Critique of Political Economy. Micaloni is the author of some essays dedicated to the relationship between Hegelian philosophy and Marx's criticism of political economy and themes and problems attributable to the Frankfurt School. Luca Micaloni, I'm not sure how to actually pronounce his name. His current research is oriented towards the reconstruction of the critical theory of society and discussion of its recent developments. For the Institute, he conducts a re-examination of Max Horkheimer's writings from the 1930s. Alright, so that's Luca or Luca, I'm assuming it's Luca Micaloni. Or Micaloni. Oh well, good thing it's not about this guy's name, because I can't pronounce it. I guess I could look it up, but I'm very lazy. Subjectivity is activity. Section 1, Subjectivity is Activity, from the early writings to the general formula of capital. In the fourth chapter of Capital, Volume 1, Marx analyzes the transformation of money into capital. While in simple circulation, the independent monetary form of value serves only the purpose of mediating the exchange of commodities and, quote, vanishes in the final result of the movement, end quote. In the money circulation, the form of value is, quote, constantly changing from one form to the other without thereby becoming lost, end quote. Marx. The conservation of money and the expansion of value through the constant alternation of money form and commodity form induces Marx to describe value as a, quote, automatic subject, end quote, or as the subject that dominates or overarches such a process. Footnote. Das übergreifende Subjekt eines solches Prozesses. And footnote. Where are we? And is endowed with the ability to add value to itself. Footnote. This ability is initially defined as, quote, occult, end quote. Marx's illustration of the production of surplus value is meant to unravel its enigmatic character, end footnote. In the course of this process, value, quote, repels value self as surplus value from itself as original value, end quote. And thus, quote, enters now, so to say, into private relations with itself, end quote. In order to describe capital's recursive self-reference, Marx also resorts to theological jargon. Value, quote, differentiates itself as original value from value's self as surplus value, just as the Father differentiates himself from himself qua the Son, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Compare Hegel's account of the transition from, quote, force and the understanding, end quote, to, quote, self-consciousness, end quote, in the phenomenology of spirit. Quote, I, the self-same being, repel myself from myself, but what is posited as distinct from me, or as unlike me, is immediately, in being so distinguished, not a distinction for me, end quote. Hegel, end footnote. The, quote, Trinitarian, end quote, similitude adopted in the general formula introduces a dialectical coexistence between capital's real dynamics and the fetishized character of its self-relation, which will also play an essential role at later stages of the exposition. Both notions of, quote, subject and, quote, automaticity raise some interpretive and theoretical issues also reflected in the recurring tendency to expunge them from translations. Footnote. Since the first edition of Capital, Marx described capital as a, quote, automatic subject that sets itself in motion, end quote. Ein automatisches in sich selbst prozessierendes Subjekt, end quote. In the second German edition, Marx kept the references to the automatic subject he had made in the first edition, but added the phrase, quote, a self-moving substance in process, end quote. Quote, ein prozessierende, sich selbst bewegende Substanz, end quote, which continued to appear up to the fourth German edition. Quote, an independent substance endowed with a motion of its own, end quote. The, quote, processual, end quote, feature of the automatic subject is no longer present in the French edition, where the phrasing of the second German edition is replaced by, quote, automatic substance endowed with its own life, end quote. As for the English translation and the Aveling Moore translation, the phrases, quote, subject of a process, end quote, and, quote, automatic subject, end quote, were replaced by, quote, active factor in a process, end quote, and, quote, automatically active character, end quote, of value, respectively, and have been restored in Ben Fawkes' Penguin translation, end footnote. Marx derives his notion of subjectivity from German idealism, particularly from Hegel, who perhaps more than any other thinker bestowed on the subject a set of features belonging to the semantic area of, quote, activity, self-motion, self-relation, negation of otherness, self-negation, quote, return, end quote, from otherness, circular movement. Footnote. On the applicability of the concept of self-relation to Hegel's philosophy, see Henrich, 1982, to 1982, pages 142 to 208. I don't know if that's supposed to be Heinrich, as in Michael Heinrich, but it says Henrich here. End footnote. Without reaching nor pursuing systematic coherence, Marx often refers to this cluster of meaning in his use of the concept of, quote, subject, end quote, including his recurring definitions of capital as subject in the critique of political economy. Since his early writings, to be a subject means to be an active and self-moving entity that moves itself through a specific circular and, quote, returning, end quote, form of movement and by virtue of endogenous power. Marx puts this argument forth already in his critique of Hegel's theory of the state when he comments on the famous section 262 of the elements of the philosophy of right. Hegel is criticized for having improperly attributed to the idea of the state subjective, active features and the capacity to, quote, posit, end quote, family and civil society as moments of its self-development, while Marx argues family and civil society are the, quote, real presuppositions, end quote, and the truly active spheres. Quote, the idea is subjectivized, and the real relationship of the family and civil society to the state is conceived as its inner, imaginary activity. The family and civil society are the preconditions of the state. The family and civil society are the true agents, but in speculative philosophy, it is the reverse. When the idea is subjectivized, the real subjects, are all transformed into unreal objective moments of the idea, end quote. Marx, 1843. In Marx's theory, this notion of subject as activity cooperates with the Aristotelian concept of hypokaimenon in order to put forth a critique of subject/predicate inversion, while in actual reality the subject is the material bearer of properties and the logical subject that holds predicates. In Hegel, predicates are made independent and become themselves subjects. A similar notion of subjectivity, along with other shades and uses of the concept of subject, recurs then in several loci of Marx's works, from the economic and philosophic manuscripts to the Grundrisse, particularly in the definition of labor's alienation, and of labor's opposition to objectified labor. Footnote, for example, this is a bunch of citations. I must admit the philosophical issues regarding the publication of both the economic and philosophic manuscripts in the Grundrisse. The translations I indicate were not based on the mega edition. End footnote. As he has seen in the general formula, Marx's formulations in the Critique of Political Economy indicate quite clearly that being an automatic subject, that is, possessing the ability to move itself in an endless circle without resorting to any external moving cause, is an essential feature of capital. Footnote. Quote, value therefore now becomes value in process, money in process, and as such capital. Value comes out of circulation, enters into circulation again, preserves and multiplies value self within value circuit, comes back out of value circuit with expanded bulk, and begins the same round ever afresh. End quote. Marx. End footnote. The conjunction of subjectivity and automaticity might seem paradoxical at first glance, but the oxymoron dissipates when we consider automaticity as equivalent to self-motion. Footnote. Western thought offers multiple uses of the notion of, quote, automaton, end quote, and of the contiguous, but not overlapping notion of, quote, self-motion, end quote. The idea of self-motion plays a crucial role in several debates, both ancient and modern. See Cambiano 1994, Gill and Lennox 1994, regarding A, the nature of the soul and its relation with the body, e.g. Plato and Phaedra, B, physics and cosmology and the movement of celestial objects in particular, see Aristotle, Physics, 8, Section 5, 275A to 258B, and C, automatic machines, see Bedini, 1964, Chapuis and Gelis, 1984, and Berryman, 2003. End footnote. Far from denoting a conditional and passive entity, moved by external factors, the notion of, quote, automaton, end quote, underlying the general formula of capital entails the subjective prerogative of being principal, cause, and beginning and end of one's own movement. In the following I show how Marx's characterization of the large-scale industry and of interest-bearing capital proves to be coherent with the circular self-movement illustrated in the general formula. Lastly, I present a few remarks on the Hegel-Marx connection, and I add some arguments in favor of the, quote, homology thesis, end quote. I think the homology thesis refers to, which is generally attributed, in my mind, I generally associate with Chris Arthur, that there's a homology between the categories of being, thought being or whatever, ontologic, I think might be the word that some people use in Hegel's science of logic, and and Marx's capital. So there's a homology between the categories of capital, the book, and Hegel's logic. I can't really speak on that because I am not an expert on Hegel. Section 2. The subject of large-scale industry. Fixed capital is self-moving automaton. The subjective structure of self-motion that defines the concept of capital also characterizes the increasing mechanization of production processes, which culminates, at least at the stage of development Marx could observe, in large-scale industry. In the transition from manufacture to large-scale industry, we witness capital's growing ability to assume properties formerly ascribed to human subjectivity. Coherently with its nature of automatic subject, capital presents capital's self as an automatic system of machinery, dead labor that shows subjective, quote, living, end quote, capacity of self-motion. In manufacture, each operation still, quote, retains the character of a handicraft and is therefore dependent on the strength, skill, quickness, and sureness of the individual workman in handling his tools. The handicraft continues to be the basis. The narrow technical basis excludes a really scientific analysis of the production process, end quote. Marx. The analytic subdivision of the labor process leads to the annexation of the workers to a partial operation. Yoked to a limited function, quote, the individual himself is divided up and transformed into the automatic motor, bracket, das automatisches Triebswerk of a fractional operation, end quote. Marx. It is worth dwelling a little on the specific meaning of, quote, automatic, end quote, at this stage, as it is significantly different from the one examined in the general formula. For the workers, the automatic character entails absence of control over their own movement and the labor process of which it is part. Deprived of freedom of initiative and of rational control, living labor is reduced to motive power of a, quote, working machine, end quote, which carries out the operation in its stead. The automatic character of the movement means the complete spoliation of the essential features of human subjectivity. Not coincidentally, Marx is to some extent in tune with Adam Ferguson, according to whom, quote, manufactures, prosper most where the mind is least consulted, end quote. And with the even more radical idea formulated by Adam Smith, according to which the worker, quote, has no occasion to exert his understanding, end quote, and only acquires dexterity in his partial operation, quote, at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues, end quote. As we shall see, the removal of subjectivity from the workers that takes place in manufacture by means of the automatization of their movement in large-scale industry is reinforced through a more thorough automation of the whole labor process that bestows subjective qualities on fixed capital. I wanted to say, this is just a thought that comes into mind when this Smith quote, at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues, end quote. It's interesting that, generally speaking, at least from what I know of, like, the history of, like, the introduction, say, of, like, the 10 Hours Bill. I believe it's the 10 Hours Bill in Great Britain in the mid-19th century. Was precisely due to this kind of diminution, particularly not of these more humanistic qualities, but these the intellectual and social, but these martial virtues. It became, at least to Heinrich, and I think it's in Marx too. I can't remember exactly, but like the physical destruction of the labor force that was being wreaked by this extremely disastrous, in human terms, labor process. Had to have state limits put onto it because it was limiting the capacity of society to reproduce itself, especially in, I think it's important in like military terms. The population of the country was becoming unfit for warfare. I can't really speak to that historically, but it's just a theme I've heard, and that's what that little quote made me think of. Okay. Where am I? As we shall see, the removal of subjectivity from the workers that takes place in manufacture by means of the automatization of their movement in large-scale industry is reinforced through a more thorough automation of the whole labor process that bestows subjective qualities on fixed capital. Marx explicitly maintains that in the logical historical progression from, quote, cooperation to, quote, manufacture and to, quote, machinery as regulative principles of capitalist production, the superior function of mental reconstruction and conscious command of the labor process are increasingly transferred from the bearers of labor power to capital. Quote, the knowledge, the judgment, and the will, which, though in ever so small a degree, are practiced by the independent peasant or handicraftsman, are now required only for the workshop as a whole. Intelligence in production expands in one direction because intelligence vanishes in many others. What is lost by the detailed laborers is concentrated in the capital that employs the detailed laborers. It is a result of the division of labor in manufactures that the laborer is brought face to face with the intellectual potencies, geistige Potenzen, of the material process of production as the property of another, as a ruling power. This separation begins in simple cooperation, where the capitalist represents the single workman, the oneness and the will of the associated labor. It is developed in manufacture, which cuts down the laborer into a detail laborer. It is completed in modern industry, which makes science a productive force distinct from labor and presses science into the service of capital. End quote, Marx. The adequation of capital to its definition as, quote, automatic subject, end quote, is gradually accomplished as machine-based production gains centrality. More thoroughly than cooperation in manufacture, large-scale industry production approximates capital to the full historical coincidence with capital's general formula. And this idea of capital remaking the world of its own image down to the labor process, right? It's the subsumption of labor processes to capital are made in capital's image, right? So there's kind of like there's like two different kinds of ideas in Marxism, and I think this is important. One of the important developments of both political Marxism and of the new Marx reading or value form analysis or what have you is this notion of the subsumption of the labor process to market imperatives, creating the fundamental character of productive processes in labor, right? And this is not something, I think it's important, one of the most important things I think from the political Marxism tradition, say like Brenner and like Ellen Mason's Wood, is this idea that this was not, this type of improvement of the labor process was not restricted to the production of industrial commodities, but also early on comes to characterize agriculture in places like England, so that and this is one of the conditions of creating a capitalist economy is if you have a massive proletariat, they need somewhere to buy food, right, with their wages, right? So there's this kind of this idea that capital not only subsumes, I'm getting carried away here, but capital subsumes the not just the industrial process, say of Adam Smith's pin factory, but the production of wheat, right? The so-called the ideology of, quote, improvement, I think in early modern England very much reflects the subsumption of agricultural labor processes once production units become not self-sufficient who are self-sufficient units that are taxed or whatever, but economic units that are market dependent, right? They must sell, they must produce to sell in order to survive, or that generally becoming more of a condition. Obviously, there's probably exceptions where people can eke out a small living on some parcel of land, and that's even true now. There's to some extent, even though that would usually drastically reduces your standard of living. Anyway, the point being is that this subsumption of the labor process to the market imperatives of capitalism takes place on the agricultural front as well as in the industrial front. And I think that the Neue Marx Lectura people and value form people also put a big emphasis on this notion of subsumption, of this kind of emergent property of capital, fundamentally pressing down on the production process and crafting it to suit its imperatives. I'm sure other people recognize this, but at the same time, there's kind of the development in the productive force is kind of attributed to this trans-historical ability of human beings and desire of human beings to want to improve the labor process in order to become more efficient. As it's a human process and not a process that's particularly specific to capitalism, and capitalism in fact dwarfs this process. And it definitely there's this kind of this idea of the objectivity or neutrality or something else of the production process that just needs to be limited from its capitalist fetters, usually by being nationalized or something like that. There's these two kind of tenuous things, and I think they're kind of in Marx, and it depends on what part of Marx you read. If you're basing your interpretation of Marx very much so on a reading of Capital and the specific necessary features of a capitalist economy, if you're focusing on that, the idea of subsumption of the labor process, is going to be way more bigger, especially if you take into account the so-called the missing sixth chapter or whatever of Capital, the results of the production process as a whole, or whatever, I can't remember what it's called. It's on this channel. It's like 8 hours long. I really highly recommend you read it. But if you're basing your Marxism on that, you get a different, and like the insights of the Grundrisse, you're definitely getting a certain picture of how an appropriately Marxian approach to technics should be. But I'm getting carried away. This is a very important part of like Pistone, but also Castoriadis in different ways, and other people. Very important book. There's a couple of really important things that you should check out on here, but the really important one would be Ellen Mason's Woods, The Origins of Capitalism, A Longer View, which I have on this channel, but also the results of the production process as a whole, or whatever it's called, by Marx, that's also on this channel, and also the books from the articles from the Critique of Technology, especially the one which has things from German people who kind of influenced some of these debates, value form, the new Marx lecture, and like the state derivation debate in West Germany. It has people like that, but it also has Raniero Panzieri from of Appareismo fame. So there's generally this change in the 20th century, I think, between a more naive view of techniques and a more critical view of technology. There was this that kind of emerged in the mid 20th century for varying reasons, and this concept of like the emergent properties of capital subsuming the production process and morphing it to its character in a kind of like a top-down causation kind of way. Became more important, and I think it was manifested in a lot of different people, including Castoriadis, including people from like value form theory, as well as like political Marxism, people who definitely put a big emphasis on the social nature of techniques. Yeah. Whereas it was upheld, it seemed, depending, whereas like a more traditional kind of like naive view of technology as being like a transhistoric, the transhistoric technological determinism, capitalism comes from the Industrial Revolution instead of creating the Industrial Revolution or something like that, and like it's kind of has still people continue to accept that. For instance, a big book that I haven't read it, but I'm pretty sure this is what it's like, is the book In Defense of Karl Marx's Theory of History by G.A. Cohen, which is critiqued rather ruthlessly in a book that's on this channel titled The Violence of Abstraction by Derek Sayers, which is a tremendous book. For a more, also, I'm rambling on here, but while I'm on the subject, another thing that would be good from this channel for this kind of subject matter would be like some of the books by, I can't remember, I never finished the book, it's a huge book, but some of the historical work of Andrew Zmolik, which is titled Rethinking the Industrial Revolution, kind of talks about, bucks against this technological determinist conception of capitalism being the product of just, transhistorical human ingenuity or desire to make life easier or something like that, which is historically not very verifiable to my understanding. Also, I should put it up on this channel. I haven't read it in a long time. I need to reread it because it was a really tremendous book. But Moishe Pistone's Time, Labor, and Social Domination definitely talks about the subsumption of the labor process to capital. And the need for socialism to not just fundamentally alter the production process, and not just have not keep it intact with just a mere redistribution of goods, but fundamentally changing its character, right? That's a whole other question, like a lot of times socialism is regarded as like production for needs, right? Production for use, right? But what's missing from that is the nature of production, right? Production, not just in terms of like, cranking out more utilities that are real as opposed to the unreal or something like that, but rearranging the humanizing of human labor as an end in itself, as a key component of socialism. That's a key, whether that's a key part of this, but I need to get back into just reading the thing, sorry. While in manufacture, quote, the workman becomes adapted to the process, end quote, with the quote, but the quote, process was previously made suitable to the workman, end quote. In production, with machinery, quote, this subjective principle of the division of labor no longer exists, end quote. And the instruments of labor instead of labor power are the starting point of the analysis of the process of production. Sorry, I don't know if I read that last paragraph properly. I'm going to reread it again because I got distracted talking out my own ass. But check out those things I said. The adequation of capital to its definition as, quote, automatic subject, end quote, is gradually accomplished as machine-based production gains centrality. More thoroughly than cooperation and manufacture, large-scale industry production approximates capital in the full historical coincidence with its general formula. While in manufacture, quote, the workman becomes adapted to the process, end quote, but, quote, the process was previously made suitable to the workman, end quote. In production with machinery, quote, this subjective principle of the division of labor no longer exists, end quote, and the instruments of labor instead of labor power are the starting point of the analysis of the process of production. Intolerant of the anthropic limitations to the expansion of relative surplus value, capital overcomes the anthropic limitations to the expansion of relative surplus value through technological development. Quote, here the process as a whole is examined objectively, in itself, that is to say, without regard to the question of its execution by human hands. It is analyzed in its constituent phases, and the problem, how to execute each detail process and bind each detail process into a whole, is solved by the aid of machines, chemistry, etc. End quote. Marx. In the paragraph on the English factory legislation, this crucial allusion to technology becomes more explicit. Quote, the principle which is pursued of resolving each process into that process's constituent movements, without any regard to their possible execution by the hand of man, created the new modern science of technology. The varied, apparently unconnected, and petrified forms of the industrial processes now resolve themselves into so many conscious and systematic applications of natural science to the attainment of given useful effects. Technology also discovered the few main fundamental forms of motion which, despite the diversity of the instruments used, are necessarily taken by every productive action of the human body, end quote. Marx. At the core of the capitalistic extraction of surplus value lies die ganz moderne Wissenschaft der Technologie, which hinges on the human application of natural science and on the ergonomic knowledge of the human body. Footnote. While the references to Charles Babbage and Andrew Ure are preserved in capital, references to the German Côté of Technologie that Marx read at least since 1851, featured in the 1863 manuscript, but were for the most part removed from the first edition of Volume 1. A further significant element, from both a philological and a theoretical point of view, is the progressive systematic substitution of many occurrences of the adjective, quote, technological, end quote, technologisch, I don't know if I'm saying that right, widely used in the first German edition of Volume 1 with, quote, technical, end quote, technisch, in the successive German editions. On this issue see Müller, 1992, Tribe, 2016, Frisson, 1992, or Frizen, I'm not sure how you say it, 1992, 1993, 1993b, Bellofiore, 2018, makes interesting remarks regarding the peculiar kind of socialization linked to technology and technology's structural function in capitalist economy, as well as its systematic pivotal position within the architecture of capital. On the text alterations in the second edition of Volume 1, see Jungnickel, 1987, end footnote. Where am I? The tendency to the, quote, objectification, end quote, of the production process and of the workers employed in it, to the demystification of the, quote, mysteries, end quote, of handicrafts takes place along with the dislocation, the marginalization, the ever-growing expulsion of labor power from production. The industrial worker can be replaced both as motive force and as keeper of indispensable knowledge, which have now been concentrated in capital through the separation of the, quote, intellectual potentialities, end quote, from the worker, and through the radicalization and the, quote, carrying out of the automatic principle, end quote, Marx. The motor mechanism has become, quote, a self-acting prime mover, end quote, Marx. And the entire labor process is now carried out, quote, by an organized system of machines, to which motion is communicated by the transmitting mechanism from a central automaton, end quote, Marx. Despite apologetic descriptions of machinery that present the, quote, combined collective worker, end quote, as, quote, the dominant subject, Übergreifendes Subject, and the mechanical automation of the object, end quote, Marx. In the new organization of the labor process, quote, the automaton itself is the subject, end quote. The adequation of capital to capital's concept, that is, to the subjective and automatic and, quote, overarching, end quote, character established by the general formula, involves once again the coexistence of actual functioning and fetish-like pretension, which cannot be reduced one to the other. Though it strives to be an automatic subject, capital cannot wholly reduce the alterity of nature and of labor to a product of capital's own absolute positing. It needs instead to internalize and subsume external factors of production through a constant asymptomatic effort. One might be thus tempted to ground the actual or latent possibility of struggle and conflict in this inescapable constraint that imposes on capital the constant renewal of subsumption of nature and labor power, as well as the extraction of labor and value from the latter. On the other hand, both the high degree of technical domination of nature and capital's exertion of social power over the working class, up to the determination of the psychophysical, cognitive, and libidinal constitution of the working class, may lead to subsumption being conceived as an irreversible result. Footnote. See Arthur, 2002, Bellofiore, 2013. A different perspective can be found in Finelli, 2014. End footnote. In fact, Marx's text is ambivalent enough to support the fluctuation of Marx's theory between these two kinds of reading. On the one hand, the interpretation of automaticity as the ultimately unattainable aim of capital. On the other, the full integration of otherness of potentially insubordinate elements. Be that as it may, for the scope of this chapter, it is sufficient to say that the multiple references to the semantic field of automaticity and self-motion, as well as the connection between automaticity and subjectivity, indicate the extent to which the automation of the labor process in large-scale industry represents for Marx an implementation of the general formula of capital as, quote, automatic subject, end quote. New section. Section 3. Interest-bearing capital is automatic fetish and real beginning. In the fifth part of Volume 3, the division of profit into interest and profit of enterprise, Marx introduces, particularly in chapters 21 and 24, the category of, quote, interest-bearing capital, end quote. In this shape, money prime, money exhibits the ability to derive money's expansion from itself alone, that is, to pursue and to obtain self-valorization exclusively through self-realization. Footnote. Volume 3 is the result of a posthumous edition conducted by Engels on the basis of Marx's manuscript. Engels' interventions affect the subdivision into chapters, the repositioning and reworking of text portions, and the theoretical determination of ambiguous phrases and passages. On these problems, see Young-Nickel 1991, Fulgraf, and Young-Nickel 1994, Fulgraf 1995, Lugansky 1995, Heinrich 1996. On Volume 3 in general, see Campbell and Rutan, 2002. I highly recommend that book as well, especially anything that comes out of the International Symposium for Marxian Theory, which that book is part of. As regards the chapters analyzed in this section, chapters 21 and 24, the partition of the matter substantially follows the manuscript. Chapters 21, chapters 24 follow chapters 1 through 4 of section 5 of the manuscript. Also, the text edited by Engels is fairly accurate and compared with the manuscript. However, at least for the quotations, I indicate in the endnotes where the edited text differs from it. In footnote. In this shape, money prime, money exhibits the ability to derive money's expansion from money self alone, that is, to pursue and to obtain self-valorization exclusively through self-relation. This, quote, meaningless abbreviation, end quote, of the whole process and of the general formula of capital seems to be homologous with an idealistic subjectivity yearning to disregard every external reality and to relate only to that idealistic subjectivity's self in a pure and unperturbed self-reference. The loss of meaning is a consequence of the fact that a purely abstract form has not only subsumed the concrete entities and subjects that grant that purely abstract form subsistence, but has also removed the entire series of mediations that purely abstract form presupposes and has, seemingly, managed to become a fully autonomous and automatic subject. The form of interest-bearing capital appears logically autonomous from the series of transitions of which interest-bearing capital is the result. Moreover, it conceals its nature of interest-bearing capital conceals interest-bearing capital's nature of product of social relations. I think there's a typo there. Condenses it into a simple, quote, thingly, end quote, givenness. Quote, the thing, money, commodity, value, is now already capital simply as a thing. The result of the overall production process appears as a property devolving on a thing in itself, end quote. Marx. All that appears in this shape is a given quantity of money, which begets money, free from contamination by empirical processes of production. There's a bunch of footnotes here. Footnote 1, in the manuscript, quote, of production and circulation, end quote, on the interchangeability in Engels' editorial work of this Hendiades, I don't fucking know what that is, and of the terms, quote, production and, quote, reproduction, see Fulgraf and Youngnickel, 1994. Next footnote, Erscheint, added by Engels. Marx often distinguishes phenomenon, quote, appearance, end quote, the partially reliable mode of manifestation of an essence, and that appearances necessarily correlate, from, quote, semblance, end quote, a superficial, illusory, and deceptive projection of an underlying reality. Such a distinction is drawn from the Hegelian one between, quote, appearance, end quote, Erscheinung, and, quote, shine, end quote, or, quote, illusory being, end quote, but does not overlap it. End footnote. Next footnote. Quote, einem Ding von sich selbst zu kommende Eigenschaft. Interpolation, end quote. Interpolation by Engels. In the manuscript, Marx, quote, ein dem Ding inhärente Eigenschaft, end quote. End footnote. However, the self-valorization of interest-bearing capital is a real property and not a mere semblance. Money here is a commodity that is alienated, in this case, loaned out, because of its capacity to act later as functioning capital, that is, to valorize itself in production and to realize itself in circulation. Borrowed capital is a peculiar commodity that is, quote, alienated only on condition that it is, first, returned to its starting point after a definite period of time, and second, is returned as realized capital so that it has realized its use value of producing surplus value, end quote, Marx. But the initial act and final return of money to the lending capitalists are, quote, legal transactions which takes place before and after the real movement of capital and have nothing to do with capital as such, end quote, Marx. It is important to notice that the expansion of capital by means of a legal transaction which is indifferent to the real process of production and realization is not a mere sleight of capital carried out by a fetishized abstract form that removes and mystifies the actual process of valorization. The fetish character coexists within the same figure with actual properties that are not reducible to the condensation and concealment of the social relations of production and of the process of production and circulation. The disappearance of the mediations that allow capital's relation with capital's self is both the way in which interest-bearing capital mystifies interest-bearing capital's genesis and a part of the way in which interest-bearing capital subsists and acts as self-expanded money. The coexistence of these two descriptions characterize chapters 21 and 24 of Volume 3. On the one hand, Marx restates that, quote, In interest-bearing capital, the capital relation reaches the capital relation's most superficial and fetishized form. End quote. Marx. On the other hand, the reification of the social relationship and the seemingly immediate self-valorization are not only ontological functions that pertain to this form, the same figure is also, quote, the original starting point of capital, end quote. Marx. That is, the real starting point of the entire economic dynamics, no longer the starting point seen as the beginning of the systematic exposition, commodity, but capital, by now capable of providing an ontological foundation to the whole process, and moreover, capital that being lent out as capital becomes itself, quote, a thing for sale, end quote. Verkaufbares Ding, Marx. And thus reconnects with the, quote, mediated immediacy, end quote, of the initial category of Volume 1. Two different social and economic functions are thus reunited in the same shape. The highest mystification of the real process, and the real ontological starting point, which is more fundamental and not simply most readily knowable by ordinary consciousness. Footnote, quote, the power of producing surplus value in geometric progression by way of an inherent secret quality as a pure automaton, end quote. Marx, end footnote. On the one hand, the exposition has spread out the whole complexity of capitalist production and reproduction, which culminates in, quote, capital in its finished form, bracket, das fertige Kapital, end bracket, the unity of the production and circulation process, and hence capital yielding a definite surplus value in a specific period of time, end quote. Marx. However, on the other hand, by virtue of the same shape, the highest mystification of the whole process also takes place. The direct valorization is both true and false, the reliable expression of reality, and the mystification of reality, endowed with ontological consistence and systematic necessity. In order to define the mystification of capital, Marx once again invokes the notion of automaticity. Quote, in interest-bearing capital, therefore, this automatic fetish is elaborated into this automatic fetish's pure form, self-valorizing value, money breeding money. In this form of interest-bearing capital, the automatic fetish no longer bears any marks of its constitution, end quote. Marx. The, quote, finished form, end quote, of the automatic fetish has removed the process mediating the finished form of the automatic fetish's genesis. But the process itself and the process's moments enjoy neither ontological consistence nor logical justification outside the generative power of the, quote, real starting point, end quote, which coexists with the fetish in the same shape. This shape represents, as we have seen, quote, the capital mystification in the capital mystification's most flagrant form, end quote, Marx, but also the real logical and ontological basis of the entire actual movement, that is, quote, the simplest form, bracket, die einfache Gestalt, end bracket, of capital, in which it is presupposed, bracket, vorausgesetzt, to its own reproduction process, end quote, Marx. That is, it activates as financing the real starting point, its reproduction process. The real beginning and the fetishized form are joined but do not coincide and represent distinct aspects of the same category. New section, section 4. Which homology, rediscussing the Hegel-Marx relation. The vast array of positions regarding the relation between Marx's critique of political economy and Hegel's logic can be reduced to two main sets. On the one hand, quote, methodological, end quote, interpretations that investigate the influence of the Hegelian mode of exposition of categories on the Marxian mode of exposition of categories. On the other hand, quote, ontological, end quote, interpretations, which maintain that the use of Hegelian categories and structures hinges on the isomorphism between those idealistic categories and socioeconomic reality. Footnote, See Arthur, 2002, Mosley and Smith, 2014. See also Bachhaus, 1997. Bachhaus's perspective, as well as that of other authors, does not fall univocally into one side of the methodological/ontological couple, which is not meant to work as a rigid distinction. End footnote. Methodological readings, despite the methodological reading's insistence on the development of the, quote, thing itself, end quote, remains most often below the genuinely ontological commitment that a Hegelian exposition requires in order to be justified and not be merely arbitrary. Ontological readings instead conceive the, quote, homology, end quote, between economic reality and Hegelian logic, focusing on the domination of, quote, pure forms, end quote, a putative historical embodiment of philosophical idealism. In so doing, they not only offer a one-sided account of the, quote, idealistic, end quote, nature of value and capital, but also fail to recognize the actual ground of the systematic dialectical framework of capital. Footnote, see Author 2002, quote, just as Hegel's logic flows from the self-movement of thought, so the dialectic of exchange sets up a form-determined system. Here the formal structures are indeed, quote, self-acting, end quote, ... The forms are in effect of such abstract purity as to constitute a real incarnation of the ideas of Hegel's logic, end quote. Compare Coletti, 1973. Quote, this society based on capital and commodities is therefore the metaphysics, the fetishism, the, quote, mystical world, end quote, even more so than Hegel's logic itself. ... This overturning, this quid pro quo, this Umkehrung, which, according to Marx, rules Hegel's logic, rules also, long before the logic, the objective mechanism of this society, end quote, Lucio Coletti. See also Reichelt, 1970, quote, Hegel's idealism, ... is the bourgeois civil society as is the bourgeois civil society as ideology, end quote, Helmut Reichelt. The critique of the, quote, deranged forms, end quote, verrückte Formen, is a relevant motif in Bachhaus, 1997. Arthur, 2003a, has summarized the results of this approach. See the criticism by Smith, 2003, and Arthur's reply, Arthur, 2003. A further development of the discussion is in Historical Materialism, 13, I guess that's Volume 13, Issue 2. For a critical examination of the homology thesis, see also Bellofiore, 2018. End footnote. The thesis of a Marxian use of Hegelian metaphysics in order to grasp the metaphysic structure of capitalist society was introduced by Lucio Coletti, though within an interpretive framework according to which Marx is, quote, problematic, end quote, and accordingly, to a certain extent his method, were to be understood as one and the same, from the early writings to the critique of political economy, a critique of subject-predicate inversions, of the subjectification of abstract forms, and of their domination over the concrete, legitimate subjects. Footnote. Quote, his discussion of subject-predicate inversion in Hegel's logic, his analysis of estrangement and alienation, and finally his critique of the fetishism of commodities and capital can all be seen as the progressive unfolding, as the ever-deepening grasp of a single problematic, end quote, Coletti. Marx's relation to Hegel was thus no longer conceived of as a materialistic appropriation of the dialectic, at last put back on its feet, but as a materialist critique of Hegel's inversions, including the dialectic, which nevertheless were the keystone of the analysis of the capitalist mode of production. The idea, along with some results of the Neue Marx-Lektura, flows into the more recent, quote, value form approach, end quote, and in the systematic dialectic account of the critique of political economy, it is again combined with a dialectical reconstruction of the exposition of economic categories. If you're interested in the Neue Marx-Lektura, check out the piece by Riccardo Bellofiore I have on the channel of Neue Marx-Lektura. If you're interested in systematic dialectic, check out the piece on systematic dialectics that I have on this channel. Most of a lot of the people I've shared on this channel apply the value form approach. So you can check all those out. Back to the text. In what follows, I will maintain, first, that Marx's Capital meets the requirements of Hegel's, quote, philosophical science, end quote, as regards Marx's Capital's difference from empirical sciences. Son of a bitch. Where am I? Footnote. This does not mean, of course, that the Marxian critique of political economy is devoid of any claim to empirical validity. End footnote. Second, that this systematic collocation lies on an ontological foundation, which is the proper terrain upon which the discussion regarding the similarities between Hegel's logic and Marx's Capital should be grafted. Third, that the, quote, Hegelian, end quote, traits of modern economy should be redefined in order to outline a non-extrinsic relation between logic and ontology within Capital, the book. Hegel claims that the experimental or empirical sciences Erfahrungswissenschaften. What? Fuck. It's kind of funny because my phone died when I was recording that, so that's where that that fuck comes from. But it's weird because it was like, I said fuck like as it died, like when it was dying. So it was like it died, but was still recording me from beyond the grave. It's almost done the piece, too. Alright. Hegel claims that experimental or empirical sciences, Erfahrungswissenschaften, quote, have found their own purposes, their own peculiar method, such as it is of defining and classifying their material, end quote. Hegel. Footnote. One might, of course, object that such a laconic formulation does not do justice to the richness of experimental methodology, which does not, or not solely consist in, quote, defining and classifying, end quote, and that Hegel's view is too narrow not only in the light of the more recent philosophy of science, but also in regard to the epistemology of his time, end footnote. What empirical sciences aim at, quote, are laws, general propositions, a theory, i.e. the thoughts of what there is, bracket, of what is given, des Vorhandens, end bracket, end quote, Hegel. In the, quote, scientific manner, end quote, of empirical science, quote, the universal, ... is on the one hand left indeterminate for the universal's self, and is not intrinsically connected to the particular, bracket, das Besondere, end bracket. Instead, both are external and contingent in relation to each other, as are likewise the combined particularities vis-a-vis each other in their reciprocal relationship, end quote. Hegel. According to Hegel, political economy, Staatseconomie, is an eminent example of an empirical, quote, intellectual, end quote, science that relies on connections established by understanding or, quote, intellect, end quote, Verstand, in which the universal and the particular are related in an extrinsic fashion. It is important to notice that such a methodological configuration of political economy is not due to a theoretical limit, but rather to the nature of political economy's ontological domain, for which Hegel is characterized by an analogous extrinsic composition of universality and particularity, and by the reciprocal externality of the particulars. Quote, its development affords the interesting spectacle, as in Smith, say, and Riccardo, of thought working upon the endless mass of details which confront thought at the outset, and extracting therefrom the simple principles of the thing, the understanding, bracket, Verstand, end bracket, effective in the thing and directing it, end quote, Hegel. The intellect is able to grasp the economic, quote, thing, end quote, Sache, adequately, only insofar as the thing is informed and regulated by, quote, intellectual, end quote, ontological principles. The only mediation between particularity and universality, between the peculiar needs of individual agents on the one hand and the reciprocal dependence on the other, of which the system of need is capable, is the intellectual form of rationality, Verständigkeit. The, quote, system of needs, end quote, replicates a salient feature of, quote, civil society, end quote, in which the individual's efforts to fulfill the individual's egoistic aims gave birth to, quote, a system of complete interdependence, end quote, ein System allseitiger Abhängigkeit, regarded as, quote, external state, end quote, as a, quote, state of necessity and of intellect, end quote. Not und Verständnis statt. Hegel. For Hegel, methodological differences rest on ontological reasons. The intellect governs the thing, and therefore the thing can be grasped by, quote, intellectual, end quote, knowledge. In the Encyclopedia, Hegel suggests that, quote, as satisfactory as this, bracket, empirical, end bracket, knowledge may initially be in its sphere, there is in the first place yet another domain of objects that are not contained therein, namely freedom, spirit, and God. ... Freedom, spirit, and God are not found in that sphere because in terms of freedom, spirit, and God's content, these objects immediately present themselves as infinite, end quote, Hegel. Infinite objects require a different kind of knowledge. The previous illustration of Marx's characterization of capital as, quote, automatic subject, end quote, should allow us to go beyond the formulaic opposition between metaphysical idealism and materialism, to understand that Marx's real detachment from Hegel ultimately hinges on the identification of capital as infinite object, or rather infinite subject. The Hegel-Marx methodological connection in Capital is of both continuity and discontinuity. On the one hand, Marx builds his critique of political economy according to Hegel's model of philosophical science, and on the other hand, he extends this model to an objectual domain that Hegel entrusts to a corresponding empirical science, legitimate in its field. If Marx concurs with Hegel on the evaluation of classical political economy as extraction of simple principles from the manifold of empirical facts, Marx supersedes Hegel's viewpoint through the critique of political economy, having shed light on the infinity of its object. Footnote. Marx sees in Adam Smith's work a methodological contradiction between the attempt, quote, to penetrate the intimate physiology of bourgeois society, end quote, and the need, quote, to find a nomenclature and corresponding concepts of intellect, Verständnisbegriffe, for these phenomena, end quote, Marx. Such a claim seems to be utterly in line with Hegel's description of political economy as, quote, intellectual, end quote, science. End footnote. Thus, methodological continuity entails Marx's implicit, quote, systematic, end quote, disagreement, which in its turn is rooted in an ontological difformity. It's a weird spelling. Diffformit. For Hegel and for classical political economy, no economic entity is capable of true infinity, while for Marx, capital is a truly infinite entity that is able to derive from itself an organic and circular totality, and hence is a suitable subject matter for a, quote, science with Hegelian characteristics, end quote. Footnote. It is of course possible to perceive a resemblance between this connotation of capital and Hegel's bad infinite. Being a determinate quantity of money, capital constantly relapses from capital's putative universality into a quantitative limit, which it strives to overcome by increasing its magnitude. Its movement can thus be defined as, quote, massless, end quote, literally, quote, measureless, end quote. However, capital's effort to become a true infinite also displays an autotelic structure. The bad infinity of the linear infinite progress coexists with the circular infinite movement that defines the concept of capital. In the light of this remark, the quotation from Galiani, quote, questo infinito che le cosa non
Hanno in progresso, Hanno in giro, end quote. That is, quote, when moving in a circle, things possess the infiniteness which they lack when advanced in a straight line, end quote, acquires greater significance. Arthur has rightly pointed out that both the bad or spurious infinity and the true infinity are relevant to an adequate description of Marx's concept of capital, in which the linear and cumulative logic of infinite progress and the circular self-motion are combined. The linear and the circular motion are synthesized in the image of the, quote, spiral, end quote. End footnote. Methodological continuity is therefore based on an ontological break, that is, on a different theoretical acquisition of the social content of civil society. In order to treat political economy as a philosophical science in the Hegelian sense, Marx needs to dismiss the Hegelian view of political economy and of the economic sphere, and to recognize the existence of a subject that is isomorphic with the infinite dynamics of the concept. Footnote. On the relevance of the distinction between intellect and reason in Marx's critique of political economy, see Reichelt, 1970. Capital is, quote, Hegelian, end quote, not only because capital fetishizes and reifies the process of capital's valorization, capital being the object capital, not the book, or the automatic subject capital, not the book capital. Capital is, quote, Hegelian, end quote, not only because capital fetishizes and reifies the process of capital's valorization and strives to interiorize through formal and real subsumption all external and possibly conflictual elements, but also because, precisely in capital's most fetishized form, capital is the real starting point of the entire economic dynamic, already, quote, present, end quote, from the beginning of the exposition, drawing on this Hegelian concept of a result of a series of mediations that is also the beginning of the series, and that after the deduction condensates itself and releases itself into reality, Marx sets the ground for its macro-monetary theory of production and of the Kreislauf, or circuit of capital. See Bellofiore, 2002, 2004. That's the end of the essay. I'm going to read the references. Aristotle's Physics in the Complete Works of Aristotle, revised for translation, Volume 1. Revised translation, Volume 1. Chris Arthur, The New Dialectic in Marx's Capital. C.J. Arthur, The Hegel-Marx Connection. C.J. Arthur, One More on the Homology Thesis, a response to Smith's reply. H.G. Backhaus, Dialectic der Wertform, Dialectic of Value Form. S. Bedini, The Role of Automata in the History of Technology. Riccardo Bellofiore, 2002, Transformation in the Monetary Circuit. Marx is a monetary theorist of production in Martha Campbell and Gert Ruyten's edited volume, the culmination of capital essays on Volume 3 of Marx's Capital. Riccardo Bellofiore, 2004, Marx and the Macroeconomic Foundations of Microeconomics, and Riccardo Bellofiore, and I think it's Nicola Taylor, edited volume, The Constitution of Capital, essays on Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. Riccardo Bellofiore, 2013, something in Italian. Riccardo Bellofiore, 2018, The Adventures of the Vergesellschaftung. S. Berryman, 2003, Ancient Automata and Mechanical Explanation. G. Cambiano, Automation. Stordici, Martha Campbell and Gert Ruyten, 2002, The Culmination of Capital, on Volume 3 of Marx's Capital. A. Chapuis and E. Gelli, 1984, Le Monde des Automates, Études historiques et techniques. Lucio Coletti, 1973, Marxism and Hegel. Lucio Coletti, 1991, Introduction to Karl Marx's Early Writings. I think it's Roberto Finelli, something in Italian. I think it's also Roberto Finesci, also in Italian. G. Frisson, Smith, Marx, and Beckman, Division of Labor, Technology, and Innovation, and H.P. Mueller, and U. Troitzich, Technologie, Zwischen, Fortschritt und Tradition. Jefferson, 1993, Linnaeus, Beckman, Marx and the Foundation of Technology, Between Natural and Social Sciences, A Hypothesis of an Ideal Type, first part, Linnaeus and Beckman, Cameralism, Economia and Technology in History and Technology. Jefferson, I don't know how to say this person's name, it's Frison. All these things are in English, so I don't know. I was saying Frisson, like it was French, but I think it's Frisson, or Frisson. G. Frisson, 1993, second and third part, Beckman and Marx, Technology and Classical Political Economy. M.L. Gill and J. Lennox, Self-Motion from Aristotle to Newton. Hegel, Phenomenologie des Geistes, Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel, Outlines of a Philosophy of Right. Hegel, Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences and Basic Outline, Part 1, Science of Logic. GFW Hegel, Wissenschaft der Logik, Erster Teil, Die objektive Logik, Erstes Buch. Oh shit, those are science of logic. D. Henrik, so what I was saying before, whether it was Heinrich, it might have been Heinrich, no, it is Henrik. D. Hendrik, Selbstverhältnisse, Gedanken und Auslegungen zu den Grundlagen der klassischen deutschen Philosophie. Wolfgang Jahn and D. Noska, I'm not sure what the D is. I'm assuming it's Wolfgang Jahn, it's W. Jahn. 1980, Ist das Aufsteigen vom Abstrakten zum Konkreten die wissenschaftlich richtige Methode. Arbeitsblätter zur Marx-Engels-Forschung. J. Young-Nickel, zu den Textänderungen von der I don't know how to say the numbers in German. Is it ein? I don't fucking know. 1 zur deutschen Auflage des ersten Bandes des Kapitals, Beträge zur Marx-Engels-Forschung. J. Young-Nickel, Bemerkungen zu den von Engels vorgenommenen Veränderungen am Marxischen Manuskript zum dritten Band des Kapitals in Beiträge zur Marx-Engels-Forschung, neue Folge, Studien zum Werk von Marx und Engels. A bunch of things by Marx. It's all in the German, but it's the economic and philosophic manuscripts. Yeah, I'm not gonna make. I was originally gonna do it because I thought it was only a little bit, but there's like so much German in these citations, but I'm not gonna do that. I thought it would just be a couple citations, but they're like all in German. But, you know, the usual suspects, Capital, Grundrisse, economic manuscripts, 1861 to 63, which is like the theories of surplus value, and so on. Fred Mosley, Tony Smith, Marx's Capital and Hegel's Logic, published in 2014. They have that with Haymarket's publishing of... Haymarket's publishing of the Historical Materials and Book series from Brill. H.P. Mueller, Karl Marx über Machinery. Alright, I'm not going to read that. Dieter D. Noska, 1976. Plato, Phaedrus in Plato Complete Works. Reichelt, V.P. Skredov, Tony Smith on the homology thesis. Keith Tribe, Erich Folgraff, I believe it's Erich Folgraff. It says E. Folgraff. Young Nickel Vygotsky. Okay. Well, that's the end of that. Thanks for listening.